Welcome to Washington Today on C-SPAN Radio for Thursday, January 13th, 2022. Supreme Court blocks President Joe Biden's COVID-19 vaccine or testing mandate for large businesses, saying that Congress did not give the federal safety agency OSHA the power to enact such a mandate. But the Supreme Court does allow the vaccine mandate for some healthcare workers to go into effect. President Joe Biden going to Capitol Hill, meeting with Senate Democrats on voting rights, looking to get all of them to support changing the Senate filibuster rule to overcome solid Republican opposition to the bills. But Democratic Senator Sinema, whose vote would be needed, repeats that she will not get rid of the filibuster because it would, quote, worsen the underlying disease of division infecting our country. The House Republican leader Kevin McCarthy explaining why he will not cooperate with the House Select Committee investigating the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol by supporters of former President Trump, as prosecutors file seditious conspiracy charges against the leader of the far-right Oath Keepers militia group and 10 suspected associates. The first time this charge has been used in the January 6th attack prosecutions, one of the few times in history, U.S. history, that the charge has been levied. President Biden pledging the federal government will buy another 500 million more COVID-19 tests to make 1 billion available for free to Americans. Also saying that soon there'll be a way for you to get a free mask. And the U.S. Senate votes down a bill to sanction the company behind Russia's Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline, an effort by Senator Ted Cruz, the sponsor, to pressure Russia to back off military threats against Ukraine. From the Associated Press, the Supreme Court has stopped the Biden administration from enforcing a requirement that employees at large businesses be vaccinated against COVID-19 or undergo weekly testing and wear a mask on the job. At the same time, the court is allowing the administration to proceed with a vaccine mandate for most healthcare workers in the U.S. The court's conservative majority concluded the administration overstepped its authority by seeking to impose the vaccine or test rule on U.S. businesses with at least 100 employees. More than 80 million people would have been affected. At the White House, some reaction to the rulings from the press secretary, Jen Psaki.
My inbox is usually pretty fast, but I was hoping you can give us that reaction to the Supreme Court opinions. And on the substance of the matter there, how much of a blow is this to the administration's pandemic response plan that the employer mandate part of the testing or vaccination mandate struck or halted, and how will that affect the course of the pandemic?
Sure. Well, I know there'll be the statement from the president that should be coming into your inboxes any moment now. But let me give you a quick reaction. First, let me start with some good news. News that maybe isn't getting enough attention yet. That's our jobs here, or my job here, I should say. CMS's requirement for healthcare workers to be vaccinated will save the lives of patients, as well as the lives of doctors, nurses, and others who work in healthcare settings. It will cover 17 million healthcare workers at 76,000 medical facilities. The Supreme Court upheld it, and we will enforce that. The Supreme Court's decision on the OSHA mandate essentially means that in this pandemic, it is up to individual employers to determine whether their workplaces will be safe for employees and whether their businesses will be safe for consumers. So President Biden, you'll see this in his statement, will be calling on and will continue to call on businesses to immediately join those who have already stepped up, including 1/3 of Fortune 100 companies, to institute vaccination requirements to protect their workers, customers, and communities. We have to keep working together in order to get this done to save more lives. I would note that there are a couple of good signs in terms of without this even in spite of the ruling that we would point to. One is that 57%, according to a Navigator poll, of Americans support vaccine requirements. According to a Wills Tower Watson's report, a survey of 534 U.S. employers, a majority, 57% of respondents have or will require their employees to get vaccinated against COVID-19. Why? Because employees want to feel safe in the workplace, because they want to incentivize workers to come back to the workplace, and because they've seen large companies across the country implement this and see how effective it is.
The White House press secretary Jen Psaki with reporters in the White House briefing room. That statement from President Biden that she referred to says in part, "I am disappointed that the Supreme Court has chosen to block common sense, life-saving requirements for employees at large businesses that were grounded squarely in both science and the law. This emergency standard allowed employers to require vaccinations or to permit workers to refuse to be vaccinated so long as they were tested once a week and wore a mask at work, a very modest burden. Part of the statement from President Biden. Now to voting rights and the filibuster. This from the Washington Post. Democrats' hopes for finally pushing through voting rights legislation after months of Republican opposition appeared to be fatally wounded Thursday, after Senator Kyrsten Sinema, Democrat of Arizona, announced she would not support changing Senate rules that have long allowed a minority of senators to block legislation. Sinema's position, outlined in the midday floor speech, echoed her previous public statements, but the circumstances in which she reiterated it. As Senate Democratic leaders prepared to launch a decisive floor debate, and less than an hour before President Biden was scheduled to arrive on Capitol Hill to deliver a final forceful appeal for action, put an exclamation point on her party's long and fruitless effort to counter restrictive Republican-passed state voting laws. That was from the Washington Post. President Biden did hold that closed-door meeting with the Senate Democrats, and then after, came out and spoke with reporters.
Mr. President, can you get your party on board? Is there a path forward, Mr. President? Mr. President, are you confident you can get this done? Mr. President, why can't you get these Mr. Vote? Mr. President, Mr. President, When is the plan to get this done?
First of all, you all ask questions about complicated subjects like, can you get this done? I hope we can get this done. The honest to God answer is, I don't know whether we can get this done. Is this mic on? I guess, anyway. And I'm not sure either. But anyway, I hope we can get this done. But I'm not sure. But one thing for certain, like every other major civil rights bill that came along, if we missed the first time, we could come back and try it a second time. We missed this time. And the state legislative bodies continue to change the law, not as to who can vote, but who gets to count the vote. Count the vote. It's about election subversion, not just whether or not people get to vote. Who counts the vote? That's what this is about. That's what makes this so different than anything else we've ever done. I don't know that we can get it done, but I know one thing. As long as I have a breath in me, as long as I'm in the White House, as long as I'm engaged at all, I'm going to be fighting to change the way these legislatures have moving. Thank you.
President Biden in the U.S. Capitol building after meeting with those Senate Democrats. Another likely opponent to changing the filibuster rule to get the voting rights bills passed is Joe Manchin, Democrat of West Virginia. In fact, he did put out a statement today saying that he will not vote to eliminate or weaken the filibuster. He spoke with the reporters after that closed-door meeting.
Can you stop right here, please? I'm sorry. There's no reason for me to stop, really, because he did a wonderful speech. It was a very human touch to it with a lot of knowledge. Well, no, I'm just saying the president gave an extremely, very passionate, very good speech. It was very human, and it was very touching. It was very good, and it was very historical. Very historical. He just did an excellent job.
That's Senator Joe Manchin. 3 other Democratic senators also speaking with reporters after the meeting with the president. Majority Leader Chuck Schumer of New York and the 2 senators from Georgia, Raphael Warnock and John Ossoff.
I'll just be quick, and then I'll leave it to John Ossoff gave an amazingly powerful speech. So I want to say the president made a powerful and strong and impassioned presentation for us to get this done, and we are going to do everything we can to pass these 2 bills. Thank you.
The state of Georgia is ground zero for these voter suppression bills that we're seeing emerge all across the country. This is a defining moral moment. It is the most important thing we can do this Congress. And I think that as we go into this Martin Luther King Jr. weekend, we have to remember his words when he said that the time comes when silence is betrayal, and that's why it's so important for us to vote. Everybody needs to be counted in this moment. I was heartened by the words from the president. We understand how urgent this is, and we're going to do everything we can to get these bills passed.
we represent a state where, as in many, laws have been passed and further laws are being offered, which would selectively disenfranchise voters, give partisan officials the power to subvert elections. The United States Senate needs to act to defend the sacred franchise and the integrity of American elections. We have the constitutional authority to do so. We cannot hide from history at this moment. Senator Reverend Warnock and I will continue to urge our colleagues that the Senate must speak now. The Senate must act now at this moment in history, defend the integrity of American elections and the sacred right to vote. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Senators John Ossoff and Raphael Warnock outside the room on Capitol Hill where President Biden met with all the Democratic senators. You also heard very briefly from the Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, who reiterated the Senate will be moving ahead to try to change the Senate filibuster rule if the Republicans, as expected, block the voting rights bills, even though apparently there are not the Senate Democratic votes needed. They're not there to change the rule. It would require all 50 Senate Democratic caucus members to do that. Go back now to the Thursday morning on the Senate floor as the Senate session opened. Senator Schumer laying out what's ahead.
The path I have laid out sets up a process by which senators can finally make clear to the American people where they stand on protecting our democracy. Republicans will have a chance to show where they stand on preserving the right of every eligible citizen to cast a ballot. Republicans will have a chance to make clear where they stand on fighting efforts to empower partisan actors to subvert the election process and create more big lies in the future. Republicans will have a chance to make clear where they stand on fighting the power of dark money, which so many Americans oppose, Democrats and Republicans. And Republicans will have a chance to show where they stand on ending partisan gerrymandering. Of course, to ultimately end debate and pass anything, we will also need 10 Republicans to join us ultimately on cloture. If they don't, we will be left with no choice but to consider changes to Senate rules so we can move forward. And changing Senate rules has been done many times before in this chamber. This is not the first, second, or third time that this is happening. All of us must make a choice about whether or not we will do our part to preserve our democratic republic in this day and age. We cannot be satisfied in thinking that democracy will win out in the end if we're not willing to put in the work, strength, and courage to defend it.
Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer Thursday morning on the Senate floor. In the early afternoon, right before President Biden came to Capitol Hill to meet with the Senate Democrats, Senator Sinema, Democrat from Arizona, gave her own floor speech, making it clear she will not support a change to the filibuster.
I support these bills because they strengthen Americans' access to the ballot box, and they better ensure that Americans' votes are counted fairly. It is through elections that Americans make their voices heard, select their representatives, and guide the future of our countries and our community. These bills help treat the symptoms of the disease, but they do not fully address the disease itself. And while I continue to support these bills, I will not support separate actions that worsen the underlying disease of division infecting our country. The debate over the Senate's 60-vote threshold shines a light on our broader challenges. There's no need for me to restate my long-standing support for the 60-vote threshold to pass legislation. There's no need for me to restate its role protecting our country from wild reversals in federal policy. It is a view I've held during my years serving in both the U.S. House and the Senate, and it is the view I continue to hold. It is the belief that I have shared many times in public settings and in private settings. Senators of both parties have offered ideas, including some that would earn my support, to make this body more productive, more deliberative, more responsive to Americans' needs, and a place of genuine debate about our country's pressing issues. And while this week's harried discussions about Senate rules are but a poor substitute for what I believe could have and should have been a thoughtful public debate at any time over the past year. Such a discussion is still a worthy goal. But a discussion of rules falls short of what is required. American politics are cyclical, and the granting of power in Washington, D.C. is exchanged regularly by the voters from one party to another. This shift of power back and forth means the Senate 60 vote threshold has proved maddening to members of both political parties in recent years, viewed either as a weapon of obstruction or a safety net to save the country from radical policies, depending on whether you serve in the majority or the minority. But what is the legislative filibuster other than a tool that requires new federal policy to be broadly supported by senators representing a broader cross-section of Americans, a guardrail, inevitably viewed as an obstacle by whoever holds the Senate majority, but which in reality ensures that millions of Americans represented by the minority party have a voice in the process. Demands to eliminate this threshold from whichever party holds the fleeting majority amount to a group of people separated on two sides of a canyon, shouting that solution to their colleagues, and that makes the rift both wider and deeper.
Senator Kyrsten Sinema on the Senate floor. Marianne LeVine is a Senate reporter with Politico, been following these issues, joining us now by phone. Thank you for being with us. Your latest article begins, "You might think Senate Democrats are trying to axe the filibuster to pass election reform. It's not quite true." Can you elaborate?
Senate Democrats right now aren't looking at an outright elimination of the filibuster, which would mean completely eliminating the 60-vote threshold to move forward on final passage of a bill. So what we mean by that is that they're looking at other changes to the Senate that would potentially allow them to pass this legislation, but that would not require an outright elimination of the filibuster. So that includes reinstating a talking filibuster, which would basically require that the minority hold the floor until for as long as they want to block any legislation that comes up, but that once a senator of the minority party leaves the floor or there's a vacancy, then the majority party can basically approve the legislation by a simple majority vote, which would be a significant change to the Senate. In addition, there's some discussion also about a carve-out just for voting rights and election reform. But as we've seen today, Senators Sinema and Manchin have both reiterated that they will not touch the 60-vote threshold. And so it's looking like a very uphill battle for proponents of rule changes.
Explain what was happening with that. Senator Sinema speaking on the floor, and then President Biden goes up and speaks with the Senate Democrats and presses ahead. Are they saying what they hope to accomplish by essentially losing?
I think a lot of Democrats think that it's important to still have the vote, even as this is headed for a failed vote Monday or whenever Leader Schumer decides to hold the vote. But it is an interesting strategy. It seems like a lot of Democrats want to say, hey, we tried on voting. We did everything we could to try to move forward and show the public that they tried to do it, even though they're set to come up short at this point.
We also got some news today that even if they had all the senators on the Democratic side agreeing to vote for the change, there's one Senator, Brian Schatz, who would not be there.
Correct. So it's looking like that could potentially affect when Senate Democrats vote on the legislation or when they vote to proceed onto the legislation. Right now, the plan that was outlined yesterday and that's been in motion is that the House voted today to pass the voting legislation that the Senate will then consider. So by doing that, the Senate is bypassing an initial vote to get onto the bill. And so they're expected to have a debate on the legislation, but the way Schumer and Speaker Pelosi have set up this moment is that basically the House is sending over a bill as a message, and in doing so, the Senate can vote by simple majority to get onto the bill, but they will need Scott's vote to do that. And so the plan for when the showdown is going to happen, it might be affected by the fact that the senator has a positive COVID test and needs to quarantine.
We're talking with Marianne LeVine with Politico. You've been up on Capitol Hill these past couple of days as the negotiations have been going on over voting rights and filibuster reform. What's it been like as with all these moving parts?
It's been an interesting time to cover this because on the one hand, Manchin and Sinema have not changed their positions, and they've been very clear this entire time that they do not support the rules change, and so that they do not support changing rules along party lines. And so it's been interesting to watch the effort to try to get them to change their minds, but it's in some ways it sometimes feels like they've been saying the whole it's an interesting time to cover it because on the one hand you have this effort by advocates for rules reform, but in some ways, the situation has been the same that it's been the last year, which is you have these two members and maybe more members who are hesitant about changing rules. Obviously, Manchin and Sinema are the most staunch proponents of keeping the Senate the way it is in terms of the rules and in terms of not wanting to change the rules along party lines. But it sort of feels similar to where the Senate has been the last year, even as there's been this big push at the moment to try to see if either of them will move, and clearly they have not.
Senate reporter Marianne LeVine with Politico. Find her stories at Politico.com. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
And as the reporter indicated, part of the process to allow the Senate to quickly take up the voting rights bills without having to go through procedural hurdles, it had started in the U.S. House today. The House passing a bill that combined the two voting rights bills the Democrats want to pass. One bill setting national standards for elections, and the other to reestablish the requirement that states and local jurisdictions with a history of discrimination get federal approval for voting law changes. Leading the House debate on the Democratic side today, G.K. Butterfield of North Carolina.
H.R. 5746, Mr. Speaker, combines two pieces of legislation vital to ensuring every American has free, equitable, and secure access to the ballot: the Freedom to Vote Act and the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, the latter of which critically also includes the Native American Voting Rights Act. Together, Mr. Speaker, these bills will combat the wave of voter suppression laws we see enacted in states all across the country, following the Supreme Court's decision in Shelby County versus Holder, a decision that undermined the essential pre-clearance protections of the Voting Rights Act. Actions which accelerated at an alarming rate following the unprecedented voter turnout in the 2020 elections. Rather than responding to increased voter participation with welcoming arms and pro-voter policies, states have instead been enacting laws that roll back access and aim to erect roadblocks to the ballot box.
Congressman G.K. Butterfield on the House floor, rising to oppose this bill package. Republican Brian Stile of Wisconsin.
Mr. Speaker, it may be a new year, but the Democrats are up to the same tricks, providing text of this legislation last night for a vote in the morning. They want to gut key voter integrity provisions, and they want to bust the Senate's filibuster in the process to do it. But I think it's important the American people understand some of the key and most egregious provisions in this bill. Let me just highlight the top four. This bill guts voter ID laws. And the irony shouldn't be lost that these are the same Democrats that want you to show an ID and a vaccine card to be able to have dinner in cities like Washington, D.C. or New York. This bill puts federal dollars into politicians' reelection campaigns. I've heard a lot of complaints about elections in my time. I have never had one person tell me our elections don't have enough money. This bill restricts states' ability to maintain their voter rolls that are essential so we know who's eligible to vote. And this bill mandates that ballots can be counted 7 days after the end of the election, delaying the final results. Delaying the final results does not instill confidence in our elections. Instead, by working to remove key voter integrity provisions in our elections, Americans will have less confidence in their elections. My priority is to make it easy to vote and hard to cheat. This bill fails that test, and I urge my colleagues to vote no.
Congressman Brian Stile. The House went on to pass this bill. Again, it's a combination of the two voting rights bills on a party line vote, 220 to 203, sent it over to the Senate, and it's going to become the starting point for debate there and votes. First, a vote to limit debate on it, known as cloture. That's going to require 60 votes out of 100, which would mean 10 Republicans would have to vote yes. And since that's not expected to happen, then they would move on to perhaps changing the filibuster rule to allow them to pass with fewer votes. All that's going to occur, we expect, over the next couple of days. The Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer saying he wants to have it finished by the Martin Luther King federal holiday on Monday. You can follow it all, gavel to gavel, on the C-SPAN networks. The House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy on Thursday, writes ABC News, doubled down on his refusal to cooperate with the House Select Committee's probe into the January 6th attack on the Capitol, 1 year to the day that the Republican leader took to the House floor and said former President Trump bears responsibility for the attack. When asked Thursday about his criticism of Trump, McCarthy said, "My criticism was to everyone," and shifted blame to Capitol security more generally. Why were we so ill-prepared that day? Pressed on why he won't cooperate, McCarthy accused the Select Committee of abusing its power before he finally, briefly, addressed his conversation with Trump. That was the reporting from ABC News. Here's that part where he addressed the conversation.
You have a unique window into the president on that day, January 6th. You were one of the only few people who spoke to him that day. Doesn't the American public have a right to know what the president of the United States was thinking and doing while the U.S. Capitol was under attack?
You know, that's a great question. You know the great thing about that? I didn't wait a year later. On January 6th, I spoke to the American public. Not by one network, but by many networks. My conversation was very short, advising the president of what was happening here. There is nothing that I can provide the January 6th committee for legislation of them moving forward. There is nothing in that realm. It is pure politics of what they're playing.
The House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy, Republican from California, and at his weekly briefing on Capitol Hill. In a separate briefing with the House Speaker, Nancy Pelosi, Democrat, also from California, she got a question about Congressman McCarthy's not cooperating with the January 6th attack investigation, and then what happens next.
Leader McCarthy says he will not comply with the January 6th Select Committee. Does he have an obligation to cooperate, and should he be subpoenaed if he refuses to continue to comply?
Yes, I think he has an obligation, as we seek the truth, to help with that. But up to the committee as to what they do next. I see what you see. I mean, they make their decisions, they come forward, and I'm not prepared to say what they do next. But they'll be telling us.
Madam Speaker, is it problematic for the investigation if all House Republicans just refuse to talk to them?
No, but we will seek the truth. We will find the truth, and the committee will use, if they have said everything is on the table. At one point, they said that in order to do that. I have confidence in the bipartisan nature of the committee. They are working very hard, as we can see in the public domain, with the product of their work, and I have confidence in them.
That's the House Speaker Nancy Pelosi at her weekly briefing. Well, several of the 10 House Republicans who voted to impeach former President Trump last year over his role in the January 6th attack on the Capitol have decided not to run for re-election and possibly face a challenger endorsed by President Trump. One today said he is running again. David Valadao of California says he's going to run in the newly drawn 22nd congressional district. In a statement, he says, "I'll continue to be an independent member of Congress who will stand up for the divisive partisanship in Washington, D.C., get things done to grow our local economy and deliver more water for our farmers and communities." Also today, this from CNN, Republican National Committee said in a letter to the Commission on Presidential Debates that it's prepared to prohibit future Republican nominees from participating in the commission-sponsored debates unless the commission makes a number of significant changes to its procedure. Washington Today continues in a minute.
One way to mark the anniversary of the January 6, 2021 riot on Capitol Hill is remembering the prayers offered by Congress's chaplains. Both the House and Senate chaplains offered memorable and often remarkable language in the hours before and after the riots. In the latest episode of the weekly podcast, you hear excerpts from the prayers delivered by House Chaplain Kibben and Senate Chaplain Black surrounding the events of January 6th.
Let us pray. Lord of our lives and sovereign of our beloved nation, we deplore the desecration of the United States Capitol building, the shedding of innocent blood, the loss of life, and the quagmire of dysfunction that threaten our democracy. These tragedies have reminded us that words matter and that the power of life and death is in the tongue. We have been warned that eternal vigilance continues to be freedom's price.
Find C-SPAN's The Weekly wherever you get podcasts.
Welcome back to Washington Today, available as a podcast on the free C-SPAN Now mobile app and wherever you get your podcasts. More on COVID-19. Again, a story from CNN. President Joe Biden on Thursday announced his administration would make high-quality masks available to Americans for free as the U.S. struggles to contain the new surge of the Omicron variant and hospitalizations from COVID-19 reach new highs. The president also announced his administration would purchase an additional 500 million COVID-19 tests on top of the 500 million tests he previously announced, and said the website where Americans can go to get the free tests shipped to them will be rolled out next week. That was from a CNN article. Here is President Biden speaking today, first on masks.
Vaccinations are obviously the most important thing we're doing, but they're not the only important thing. First, masking. Masking is an important tool to control the spread of COVID-19. And when you're indoors in public places, you should wear the mask. And there are a lot, lots of different kinds of masks out there. And the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC, says that wearing a well-fitting mask of any of them is certainly better than not wearing a mask if it's well-fitting. What if over your nose? But it's about one-third of Americans report they don't wear a mask at all. As I've said in the last 2 years, please wear a mask. If you're in I think it's part of your patriotic duty. It's not that comfortable. It's a pain in the neck. But I've taken every action I can as president to require people to wear masks in federal buildings and on airplanes and trains because they cross state lines. I've made sure that our doctors and nurses and first responders have the masks they need. Never again we're going to have our nurses using homemade masks and garbage bags over their clothing for hospitals because they don't have the gowns. We've more than tripled our stockpile of the most protective specialized N95 masks since coming into office. This is going to make sure that there will be an ample supply of healthcare workers and first responders. We also have helped make sure that high-quality masks are widely available in ample supply at affordable prices, sold online and in stores. But I know that for some Americans, the mask is not always affordable or convenient to get. So, next week we'll announce how we are making high-quality masks available to the American people for free. I know we all wish that we could finally be done with wearing masks. I get it. But they're a really important tool to stop the spread, especially of a highly transmittable Omicron variant. So please wear the mask.
President Joe Biden speaking from the Eisenhower Executive Office building, part of the White House complex. He also focused on making it easier to get a COVID-19 test if you think you've been exposed to the virus.
We're on track to roll out a website next week where you can order free tests shipped to your home. And in addition to the 500 million, 500 million tests that are in the process of being acquired to ship to you homes for free, today I'm directing my team to procure an additional 500 million, additional 500 million more tests to distribute for free. That means 1 billion tests in total to meet future demand. And we'll continue to work with the retailers and online retailers to increase availability. And for those who want an immediate test, we continue to add FEMA testing sites so that there are more free in-person testing sites. For those of you with insurance, you can get reimbursed for 8 tests a month. For those without insurance, we have over 20,000 free testing sites all around the country. You can find the nearest testing sites for you by Googling COVID test near me. Google COVID test near me.
President Biden at the Eisenhower Executive Office building ahead of a virtual meeting that he was going to have with Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin and the head of FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, Deanne Criswell, and also federal surge teams that have been deployed to hospitals in Arizona, New York, and Michigan. And the president announcing today plans to deploy more medical teams to a half-dozen states to help hospitals deal with COVID, as the Department of Health and Human Services says that over 150,000 Americans are now in the hospital with COVID-19. Also today, the Senate Help Committee, Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions, voting to advance the president's nominee to head the Food and Drug Administration, Dr. Robert Califf. The vote was 13-8, sending it to the full Senate for consideration. Voting no were 6 Democrats: Bill Cassidy, Mike Braun, Roger Marshall, Tim Scott, Tommy Tuberville, and Jerry Moran, and 2 members of the Senate Democratic Caucus, Independent Bernie Sanders and Democrat Maggie Hassan. Republican Senator Rand Paul did not vote. A headline at Barron's, Lael Brainerd says inflation is too high. She's open to a rate hike in March. Lael Brainerd is the president's nominee for Federal Reserve Vice Chair. She had a confirmation hearing today before the Senate Banking Committee. During the hearing, she was asked about inflation by Senator John Kennedy, Republican of Louisiana. He then turns to the issue of climate change and whether federal banking regulatory policy should discourage investment in certain energy sectors.
Governor, I realize at the Federal Reserve that you have a big staff that advises you on inflation. And based on their track record, my guess is they also advised people to buy condos in Las Vegas in 2007. But you don't have to accept their advice. So, with respect to your predictions on inflation, how did you get it so wrong?
Well, Senator, thank you.
Could you move closer to the mic for me?
Yes, of course. Thank you for your question, Senator.
You're welcome.
So I think, nobody got the pandemic right. The pandemic is unprecedented.
Yeah, but I'm asking you about inflation.
Yeah, so I think as forecasters, private forecasters, certainly the forecasters, the SEP, the whole committee, we thought that perhaps we would see a more rapid resolution of the pandemic and the supply-demand mismatches, so in particular in cars.
Excuse me for interrupting, but I don't have much time. Do you think, are you saying that inflation was caused by the pandemic?
So we certainly have seen the perpetuation, for instance, of the Delta variant leading to
Yes, ma'am, but are you saying that the inflation is caused by the pandemic?
I certainly think the supply-demand imbalances that have been the biggest contributors to the very high inflation we've seen are directly attributable to supply chain issues, distortions in demand.
Well, but here's what troubles me about that. I'll agree that inflation is spreading, but I don't see people going around coughing inflation on each other. I think, and I understand supply chains matter, but so does the demand side, and so does too much money chasing too few goods. And I don't think, and I don't think any fair-minded person thinks that inflation is solely the result of the pandemic. Let me move on. Do you think that federal regulatory authorities should use their considerable power, not just the Federal Reserve, but federal regulatory authorities? Do you think they should use their considerable power to discourage private banks from lending money to oil and gas companies?
No.
Ma'am?
No.
Okay. Do you think that those federal regulatory authorities should use their power to discourage private banks from lending money to gun manufacturers and dealers?
It's not our job. We don't tell banks what sectors to lend to. We just ask them to risk manage, and we make sure they have good processes in
Well,
place.
I agree with you, and I thank you for that. Will you issue a statement to that effect if you're confirmed?
Well, I certainly have made that statement. We'll continue to make
Yes,
that
ma'am.
statement.
Would you issue a separate statement saying, I want to make it clear for what it's worth to all of my colleagues in government, I don't think that you should use your power to discourage private banks from lending money to oil and gas companies and to gun manufacturers.
Well,
Will you do that?
Well, I won't tell other regulators what to do, but I will be happy to talk about what we do at the Federal Reserve, what our statutory authorities require us to do.
Lael Brainerd is nominated for Federal Reserve Board Vice Chair, being questioned by Senator John Kennedy at today's Banking Committee confirmation hearing. On the issue of climate change, an article at MarketWatch explains the Fed is contemplating having banks complete climate scenario analysis to identify risks. This is not the same as the stress test the Fed conducts to make sure banks have adequate capital to withstand a severe recession. Lael Brainerd has served on the Fed's board of directors since 2014. She was confirmed by the Senate then on a bipartisan vote, 61-31, and she is the only Democrat currently on the Fed board. Testifying alongside her today at the Banking Committee, Sandra Thompson, who is nominated to direct the FHFA, Federal Housing Finance Authority. She currently is the deputy director. She was asked by the committee chair, Democrat Sherrod Brown of Ohio, about lending policy and race.
GSEs have reported about 4% of their new mortgages over the past 2 years went to black borrowers. Fewer than 11% went to Latino borrowers. For refinance loans, the shares are even lower. Compare that to FHA, which most recently reported that 17% of loans went to black borrowers, and more than 25% to Latino borrowers. What should GSEs do to make sure that they're serving borrowers of color equally?
Thank you for the question, Senator. Certainly, we believe that every American ought to have sustainable and affordable housing and also places to live if they're renters. With regard to the black and ownership gap, one of the things that we've done is we've asked the enterprises to come up with some equitable housing plans, and they are supposed to focus on and identify barriers that underserved communities, particularly in communities of color, have as it relates to getting a mortgage. They're supposed to identify barriers and then come up with specific plans to execute the requirements that they've developed. We also have a focus, as you all know, on all underserved communities, whether they're rural or tribal and other areas around the country. But we think that these housing equitable plans will go a long way to help minority homeownerships in underserved communities across the country have access to mortgage credit.
Sandra Thompson, nominated to be director of the Federal Housing Finance Agency, questioned by Senator Sherrod Brown, the Banking Committee chair, at today's confirmation hearing. GSEs are government-sponsored enterprises. Some well-known ones include the Federal National Mortgage Association, or Fannie Mae, and the Federal Home Loan Mortgage Corporation, or Freddie Mac. Wall Street today, the Dow down 176, NASDAQ down 381, S&P down 67. Dallas Morning News reporting Thursday morning, with Russian troops massed on Ukraine's borders, a related showdown looms in the Senate over potential sanctions. Senator Ted Cruz wants economic penalties aimed at blocking Russia's Nord Stream 2, a pipeline that would bring heating fuel to Germany and cash to Moscow. Last month, he secured a promise of a vote on that bill by Monday in exchange for allowing the Senate to confirm dozens of stalled diplomatic nominees. Well, that vote happened today, and it got more than 50 votes, but did not get the 60 required for passage. Here's some of the debate ahead of the vote, starting with Ted Cruz, Republican from Texas.
The eyes of history are upon us. Today, each of us will be faced with a momentous question. Can we put petty differences aside? And can we come together to defend our friend and our ally, Ukraine, against imminent Russian aggression? This isn't theoretical. Russian tanks and troops are right now massed on the Ukrainian border, and they are preparing for invasion. The Senate, in just a few hours, will vote on a bill that represents the best way to deter Putin from invading Ukraine by sanctioning the company that is racing to finish and make operational the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which Putin desperately wants completed so that he can use it as a cudgel against our European allies. If we don't come together today, Ukraine risks getting wiped off the map altogether. Putin didn't just wake up one day and decide he wanted to invade Ukraine. He's wanted to invade Ukraine for years. And he did so already in 2014. But he stopped short of a full invasion because he couldn't endanger Ukraine's energy infrastructure, which he needs to get Russia's natural gas to Europe. That stopped Putin from marching all the way to Kiev. The next year, in 2015, Putin began the Nord Stream 2 project to build a pipeline to go around Ukraine so that he could get his gas to Europe and invade Ukraine with no risk to the billions he relies on every year.
Senator Ted Cruz on the Senate floor in Washington, D.C. Opposing his bill, Democratic Senator Jeanne Shaheen of New Hampshire.
I have been a strong and long-standing opponent of Nord Stream 2. I believe now what I believed at the time that I originally co-sponsored the Nord Stream 2 sanctions bill with Senator Cruz, that the Nord Stream 2 pipeline is a long-term threat to the energy security of Europe. But right now we're in a different place on this. And while Senator Cruz and I worked together on sanctions legislation to stop this pipeline, my disagreement now with Senator Cruz is in his approach to what we need to do to address what is right now a much more serious threat to Europe, to NATO, to the transatlantic alliance, and that is Russia's threat against Ukraine. And what Senator Cruz's bill would do is not stop Nord Stream 2. It would undermine the current diplomatic situation that is absolutely critical if we are going to respond to the Russian threat. His bill is a vote, supporting his bill would be a vote to compromise transatlantic unity. It is a vote that breaks the message of bipartisan support in the face of Russian aggression, and furthermore, not just bipartisan support, but allied support with the United States and Germany and Western Europe against the threat that Russia poses to Ukraine and really to Eastern Germany if they take this action.
Senator Jeanne Shaheen on the Senate floor. Again, the Senate voting not to pass this bill. It was under an agreement, 60 votes required. It got over 50, did not get 60. And Senator Bob Menendez, Democrat from New Jersey and chair of the Foreign Relations Committee, now introducing a bill that would trigger sanctions on Nord Stream 2, but only if Russia escalates its violence against Ukraine. This all comes as U.S., NATO members, and Russia held a week of talks in Europe about Ukraine. Today at the White House, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan with an update.
We've now completed an intensive week of diplomacy in multiple formats: the Strategic Stability Dialogue, the NATO-Russia Council, and the OSCE. Russia raised its concerns, we raised our concerns, including the actions Russia has taken to undermine European security that Secretary Blinken spoke so eloquently about last week. We stuck to our core premise of reciprocity. We were firm in our principles and clear about those areas where we can make progress and those areas that are non-starters. Allied unity and transatlantic solidarity were on full display, and they remain on full display. The discussions were frank and direct. They were useful. They gave us and our allies things to consider. They gave Russia things to consider. We will now reflect and consult with allies and partners on how to proceed. We're prepared to continue with diplomacy to advance security and stability in the Euro-Atlantic. We're equally prepared if Russia chooses a different path. We continue to coordinate intensively with partners on severe economic measures in response to a further Russian invasion of Ukraine. We continue to work with allies at NATO on changes in force posture and capabilities, especially on NATO's eastern flank, if that scenario arises. And we continue to support Ukraine and the Ukrainian people in the defense of their sovereignty and territorial integrity. We have been very clear with Russia on the costs and consequences of further military action or destabilization in Ukraine. So we're ready either way. We're ready to make progress at the negotiating table, serious, tangible progress on important issues of concern to us, to Europe, and to Russia in an environment of de-escalation. And we're ready to take the necessary and proper steps to defend our allies, support our partners, and respond robustly to any naked aggression that might occur. In our view, diplomacy is the more sensible path. The Russians will have to make their own assessment. In terms of next steps in the diplomatic process, we'll remain engaged with allies and partners and with the Russians and make determinations in the coming days about what comes next.
The National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan with reporters in the White House briefing room. Associated Press reporting from Moscow, Russia on Thursday sharply raised the stakes in its dispute with the West over Ukraine, with a top diplomat refusing to rule out a Russian military deployment to Cuba and Venezuela if tensions with the United States mount. And Jake Sullivan asked about that today. He called it bluster in the public commentary. Thanks for listening to Washington Today. You can get more top Washington stories each day sent right to you by subscribing to C-SPAN's evening newsletter Word for Word. Go to c-span.org/connect to subscribe. Hope you have a good night.